Cast your ballot, hope for the best. Good evening. My name is Bahman Yazdanfar, and this is Voters Echo, a weekly program brought to you to discuss different elements of our social, economical, and political status in Toronto, Ontario, and Canada in general. A couple of disclaimers. I am under payroll of no individual, no union, no political party, no corporation. I do this show on my own. I do not make any money out of that, and the airtime for the show has been donated by Dr. James Sears as part of his credit to that channel studio, which I appreciate in advance. I am neither member or sympathizer any mainstream political party, provincially or federally. And all of the opinion in this program is either, if it comes out of my mouth, is my opinion, and if it is out of the mouth of my guest, it is their opinion. I do not, and if I have candidates or members of the parliament, which you have seen in the past, it does not necessarily mean that I endorse them. I may or may not agree with part of their opinion. That is up to you to make that judgment the next time around when the election comes to your neighborhood. Make a decision informatively and make your cast very wisely. Today we have a guest via Skype, Barbara. Thank you for accepting my invitation.
Thank you for inviting me. This is exciting.
And for our viewers, can you just introduce yourself with your full name and a few minutes of your background and what you do and so on?
Certainly, yeah. So my name is Dr. Barbara Perry. I'm professor in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at University of Ontario Institute of Technology, just down the road in Oshawa, Ontario. I guess I describe myself as an expert in sort of social justice generally, but with a particular interest in hate crime and racialized violence, Islamophobic violence, violence motivated by religion, by LGBTQ status, quite broadly, but with particular interest in the community impacts of hate crime. More recently, I've been working in the area, and this is sort of what's been, I think, very much in the news in the last couple of weeks, the work that we've been doing around right-wing extremism in Canada, which is very much an under...
I'm sorry, what extremism?
Right-wing extremism.
Oh, right-wing. Okay.
Yeah. So, you know, the emphasis in the Canadian context has been around Islamic extremism, and we've neglected, and in fact, in some cases, absolutely denied the reality of right-wing extremism, white supremacy organizations in particular.
Actually, the reason I reached you because of an article. I had a guest a couple of weeks ago on my show, Paul from who regarding the freedom of speech. As I said, my guests have all sorts of the backgrounds. Is not necessarily means that I agree, but in that particular interview, I totally agree with the issue of the freedom of speech and a stifling of the freedom of speech under justification of any ideology that you name it. But and when I read that one article online, I came across your name. And because I saw someone who is an expert in the hate crime or the legality of the hate crime, I just wanted not to challenge you, but to bring a different side of the argument, so to speak, to our audience. This program is educational. Again, as you heard, I am not making money or anything like that, and I am not belong to any party. So, but I am very outspoken about my own opinions. We are getting to that very soon, and you will find out. Now, let's start with the issue of the hate crime. And before I ask the main question, because you just, I had a gentleman who was conservative candidate in last federal election. Who is a police officer by profession for the last 39 years. And he described that he was one of the originators of the suggesting that the issue of the hate crime in Ontario or Canada. You can go there, the records is there, but this time it's for you. My first question is, which I ask him as well, why hate crime? Crime is crime. What is the difference? First of all, can you define the difference between hate crime and crime?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on whether you're asking, from a legal perspective or from a sociological perspective.
Get both of them. Get both. Give me both of them.
Yeah. So from a legal perspective, hate crime is a crime. So there is a predicating offense. There is an assault. There's an arson. There's some sort of criminal offense that can be seen to have been motivated by bias or prejudice towards the community of which the victim is a part.
Okay.
So it's motivated by bias and prejudice.
Okay.
From a sociological perspective, yeah, I mean that's a really good starting point. And the bias and the prejudice is very important to keep in mind. But again, I would define sort of the violence much more broadly than just beyond the criminal offense. But more importantly, it really revolves around what is the impact, what is the significance of this sort of violence that's motivated by bias, and that's what distinguishes it for me as a sociologist. Is because the intent is it's a message crime. We describe it as a message crime. The intent is not just to impact a particular individual, but to send a broader message to the community of which they're a part. That they're not welcome, that they are considered to be deviant, to be the other, to not be, valued in our society. And so there's that added level of harm to the individual, and we certainly see that in the scholarship that looks at the differences in terms of the impact between non-bias motivated and bias motivated crimes on the individual victim, but also in the broader literature and my own work that looks at the impacts of the same kind of violence, not on the individual, but on the community as well. And that it does have a silencing and an oppressive impact on the community. So that's what distinguishes it.
Okay.
I think is largely.
So if I understood correctly, let's say John Doe goes and beats someone, and right now, I mean, if John Doe beats Jane Doe. And if it is, let's say, domestic violence, there is a law has already on the book for that purpose. If Jane Doe is a stranger on the street and John Doe goes and punch her in the face, still there is a law there, so he can be prosecuted. If John Doe goes and beat Jane Doe because Jane Doe is, let's say, a lesbian, still is the beating. Is there legally, first before we get to the socially, legally, is there any difference between the punishment in these three scenarios that just described? Or is it very distinct?
It's not guaranteed. So we don't have an independent offense that's called a hate crime. So when we recognize and acknowledge hate crime, that comes at the level of sentencing. So someone's been found guilty of this assault. It's at the level of sentencing then that judges may take into account the aggravating circumstance of bias. That's when there can be a shift in the penalty associated with it. So a penalty increase because of the motivation.
Because of the motivation. So,
Yes.
Now, have you studied history as part of your research as well? In general, the history of the mankind. I mean, politically, in general.
I'm not sure what the question is.
No. Before I ask the question, I just want to make sure that what is the extent of your knowledge in the history in general, or political history, or political science.
Well, I have a very strong background in sort of the evolution of rights doctrines and dialogue around human rights.
Okay.
And
So you probably read much more than me. But the point I'm trying to now, the question comes here. If we go back as far as, let's say, Babylonian, and come to the Romans, go to Ottomanians, go to the time of the Second World War. Whoever was in the control decide the boundaries of what it considered to be hate, depending on the political desire.
Well, that's a relatively new, sort of new convention, I think, to acknowledge the role that prejudice and oppression and power dynamics and power relationships play in, the position of particular groups and the victimization of particular groups in particular. If we look at lynching, for example, a perfectly accepted and legal practice in the U.S. Until into the 30s, 40s, 50s, even. So, I think that what is legally recognized is very different than what is legally recognized is very different than what is socially.
And my point is, if let's say if you go to Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. And if you do, they get the Islam to the extreme extent, mm-hmm. to even to prosecute their own. Mm-hmm. And if you go in the paradox, go to United States or Canada, which is relatively free society, you see completely different spectrum of the multiculturalism, multi style of the living even. How one could describe that one is hate and what is not in the free society here?
Well, that as you suggest, right? It is historically and culturally specific what we define as who we define first of all as the other, and what we define as acceptable. And even in terms of what we define as acceptable and legitimate targets of that hatred. So I don't disagree that there are cultural specificities to that. In the Canadian context, I think we have a very clear record around our human rights legislation in terms of our human rights precedent as well. In terms of protecting and preserving the sanctity and the integrity of groups that are targeted by various forms of discrimination, not just the violence. So I speak from a Western perspective, obviously,
and that is why I want to know. Are we? Did you lose the connection? Sorry.
And I would say specific, but also very broad understanding of the protections that are allowed to marginalized communities.
That is why I'm just wondering, for instance, in Toronto or in GTA, and especially in GTA and its vicinity, that we have almost people from 109 or 110 countries, mm-hmm. with wide spectrum of the religion and behavioral habits. How can we define what is hate and what is not? I mean, I could understand if you go to Germany in 1940s, they say, okay, Jews are bad, and therefore they discriminate against one group of the people and even kill them. But when you talk about a society in 2016 in Toronto, in Canada, in general, or at least in urban area, with all this variety, how mm-hmm. could we pinpoint one or two or three or a list of a spectrum and say, okay, these people, if they are told something, it is hate crime?
Well, I guess my first response would be that, and I talk about this a lot in my scholarship and in my classes even, is to use this term hate, I think, is really restrictive because that does imply a particular kind of emotion. That's why I like to talk about bias or about targeted violence. That is violence that's directed towards people because of their identity. And in particular, very often, and most typically, their stigmatized identity. So these are communities that are already demonized, that are disvalued in our culture, those that are perceived as a threat by predominantly white perpetrators, because there's the majority of violence that we see is not inter-ethnic, and it's not sort of top down. It is sort of dominant culture perpetrated against subordinate cultures. So these are people who are perceived as a threat because they threaten our Canadian values, however we define that, our Canadian culture, because we create stereotypes around particular groups about them being more criminogenic or more violent or more dangerous than others. I think there's no denying that we have created through the media, through political rhetoric, very clear categories of the other who are threats, and these are the people who become targets of violence, and even more so perhaps in a multicultural society. As much as we value those ideals, we don't always live up to that, because we have embraced immigration as a policy and as a practice, but not everyone has necessarily accepted that as a part of their everyday reality.
Barb, I want to just give a short comment based on what you just said, and then see and inquire your view after hearing those comments. I personally am I'm a non-white person myself, and quite honestly, let's say in last 30 years that I live in Canada, I experienced a more kind of the sensation of the bias or prejudice from the non-white than whites in general. That is my experience. And I found out I was telling to someone just a week ago, I said, if I go to a court and if the judge has a background, let's say, I'm just using that for the sake of the discussion. Let's say is from India or from Jamaica or something. I probably have more concern than having an Irish-based born in Canada, because at least based on my personal experience, I am expecting some sort of the common sense in his or her judgment.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's sort of there's sort of two pieces to that, and one is one of the areas I don't work a lot around judiciary or other agents of the state.
I just use the judiciary just as an example. Yeah. I could go to and buy pizza.
Yeah, but I do work a lot with law enforcement, and this is something that I have done some research here, and I know the literature around law enforcement. And one of the issues is that there's what we call double marginality.
Okay, and what is that?
So if you have you anticipate for example a black police officer, the anticipation is that they're going to be more understanding of the black experience and what the day-to-day life is and life experiences of black people in the community are, but what you find is often that they are also overwhelmed by the police culture, which is continues to be very much sort of have a racial bias. Okay. And so they begin to play into that. So there's almost a sense of in the case you gave, it might be the case amongst the judiciary, but amongst police as well, there's almost a sense of I picked myself up by the bootstraps, so there's no reason that other members of my community can't also do the same. So there's that sort of piece, but that sort of intra I guess minority on minority, shall we call it that, sort of discrimination is different than what we see in hate crime, where you're talking about people on the street. You're not talking about people in positions of authority. You're talking about people on the street, and from my research with very diverse communities, but also the broader research, we see very much less violence between these marginalized communities than we do perpetrated by the white straight male, predominantly male community on other marginalized communities. So that's what the scholarship tells us.
Okay, you mean this is some sort of the valid data that is validated? What you just said?
Yep, yep.
And
Even if you look at the our Canadian official hate crime statistics, which they're lacking, but they're the most systematic set of data that we have. It's pretty consistent that the perpetrators are young white males. That there is very little, and certainly white males, white people generally dramatically underrepresented as victims, overrepresented as perpetrators, and you would say the opposite about sort of more subordinated communities.
let me, since you brought that up, and I don't know, I don't have access to that data, but let me ask you this then, just as a follow-up. Where you stand in the personal responsibility as well as rhetoric that we get from our officials. For instance, if you, let's say, I'm just using that as an exaggerated example, south of border, you see Donald Trump goes and say, hey, don't let any Mexican come in or any Muslim come in. That is one, as I said, it's very extreme. But what I'm saying is, if one person in a position of authority or position of the social status, either it is money or it is the celebrity status, say something that impacts the behavior of certain ignorant individual. When I say ignorant, not necessarily stupid, but ignorant in that matter. Ignorant individual to behave or take the law in his own hand or her own hand and just go and beat the hell out of someone who is either Mexican or Muslim, for instance. Where do you draw the issue of the personal responsibility? And the reason I am asking that, because you just earlier alluded that if there is a cop who is a black and it is he said, I can if I strapped on to be a cop, why my other guys cannot do that? Then it is the issue of the personal decision making and personal responsibility, not necessarily hate in the form of the going after just this particular group because we are white.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my argument has long been that hate crime and prejudice generally is really an expression of sort of what are normative values, what are normative reactions to particular groups. And in the context of hate crime, and when we're talking about political ideologies and rhetoric, and media representations as well, that I argue that these are the sorts of things that create an enabling environment, what I call a climate for hate, that allow these sorts of beliefs to flourish in a culture. And I think there's probably no clear example. So I've done a lot of work recently on right-wing extremism, the white supremacist groups I was talking about earlier, skinhead groups, neo-Nazi organizations, that sort of thing. And they're very, very vibrant in Quebec, for example, and they take a flavor that's very much like the European Islamophobic reaction, which is no surprise if you think about the previous administration there, and this cult charter of values that really was meant to segregate and to other Muslims in Quebec society. So it's no surprise that that's probably one of the areas where you see these movements flourishing. And if you look online, even, all you have to do is look at responses to articles around immigration, around, Islam in Canada, and you see individuals reflecting that same kind of rhetoric, that same kind of language of, the Muslim other and the threat that they pose. So I think that, again, the work that I've done around Islamophobia is most telling in that respect. A series of interviews and focus groups that I did a few years ago really highlighted the role within the community that they saw both the media and politicians playing. And that was about the time that Harper coined that phrase, Islamicization of Canada, and posed that as the greatest threat to Canadian culture. So you can imagine how that kind of language and from that level of authority trickles down into the broader culture.
So it shouldn't be I mean, the wiser choice shouldn't be toward the message that comes from the mass influence sources such as mainstream media, rather than focusing on the individuals that maybe someone punched someone else because he didn't have a mental capacity to analyze what he read or saw on TV.
I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both. I think that we have to challenge the narratives at the broader political level, or the media, challenge media stereotypes, that sort of thing. But there's also obviously plenty of room to be done at the individual level, and intervening there, through education, through one-on-one. We don't have many, in part because we don't prosecute under the hate crime legislation very often, so we don't have many opportunities to then say this is the way we should respond to the offenders. But in that case, so there was an example a few years ago. We had an offender at the local level who had been found guilty. It was an assault against a gay person, and it wasn't sentenced as a hate crime, so he didn't get the sentence enhancement, but part of the sentence was that he engaged with, at the time I was working with PFLAG, Parents, Friends, and of Lesbians and Gays, as I still am. So part of his sentence was that he meet with us and get that one-to-one conversation, that one-to-one training about what was the impact, what was the impact of that crime, not just on the individual, but on the broader community, and what was the effect, and what was the basis of his bias, and trying to unpack some of that. So it's both at the broader political level, but also at the very individual level as well.
No, I understand that. What I'm saying is, if really, let's say in the household, if we have two fires to put out, we usually go after the big one first and then go after the small one. When in this scenario you just described, when you see the rhetoric from the mainstream media, especially something like CBC or Toronto Star or Globe and Mail or National Post, and then you say, hey, this is written over there. You may like one over another. That's fine. It is your personal choice. But nevertheless, all of these publications and the media outlet, they have millions of the viewers or readers or subscribers. Mm-hmm. So if I am being arrested just because I call someone, let's say, nasty Muslim or nasty Jew or nasty lesbian or nasty gay, I think the way that I see it so far, just please enlighten me. If they prosecute me and the media does whatever it does irresponsibly, I think I am being being used as a patsy to become a symbol of the much greater political narrative.
Well, we have human agency as well, don't we?
I'm sorry?
That we have human agency. We have the capacity to understand what is right, what is wrong. Sometimes, it's a little more difficult to unpack that, given not just the political environment, but perhaps your family environment as well. That you've been brought up to believe that being gay is wrong. Those sorts of things. But in our broader culture,
then the parents should be prosecuted
under multiculturalism, right? Under our Charter of Rights, that runs contrary to that. So, but we do have human agency, right? You anticipate that through our education system, and this is one of the roles that I play as an educator, is always encouraging my students to call out people, when they're telling homophobic jokes or Islamophobic jokes or racist jokes, whatever the case may be. And so, again, you can't separate the structural, I think, from the personal, from the agency piece of that.
And let me challenge you in something you said just earlier about the issue of the segregation that you mentioned, if I understood correctly, that one of the basis of this bias and hate crime or the or crime against a special group is form of the segregating that particular group away from the others. Now, when we look at let's say our governments, I'm talking about federally and provincially, not necessarily municipally. Both of them, they have ministries called multiculturalism. They both of them spend millions of dollars in each province and federally. And my understanding when I came to Canada 30 years ago was become part of the Canadian society. But what I have experienced again personally, because I have been involved in the politics, I ran as a candidate and so on, myself, I experienced that most of this money, or even all of this money, is being spent to ghettoizing every community in their own corner. And that by itself creates, based on what you just described, that some white dude goes and attack a group of the people from Pakistan or Muslims, that by itself creates a bullseye for those particular individuals, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, that's really interesting that you put it in those terms, in terms of the policy, the way that we've practiced the policy and implemented it is to, I think what we've done is celebrate particular communities as much as we celebrated sort of the integration of those communities. And I guess I want to push back a little bit on that, because I think that a lot of the funds have also been devoted towards, so for example, multi-faith initiatives and multicultural initiatives, as opposed to only, initiatives that celebrate one community and this community and the other community. So I think we've done a little bit of both. And maybe that's the beauty of the Canadian approach as opposed to the American approach, for example. So here we both celebrate the individualism and the unique features of those communities, but we also, I think, in terms of some of our more public events, do provide the foundation or the capacity to have, even in our own little town in Oshawa, right? We have Fiesta Week, for example, where it is a multicultural celebration. It's not just individualizing them. And so communities are coming together and sharing not their differences, but their similarities in many respects. So, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to celebrate the unique features of particular communities, while also recognizing, the diversity. So, to hold communities separate in terms of funding initiatives that support them, I think that's absolutely fine. We need to allow for the strength of those communities, the growth of those communities.
I don't have any problem with the issue of the individualism. I am one of the most non-conformist individual you can ever meet. So really, I don't have problem with having and recognizing certain communities, certain faith, and so on. The reason I brought that issue up based on the segregation was, let's say if we have, let's say in Oshawa, let's say we have major communities of 20 ethnicity background. And if there is certain budget for the multiculturalism, and if out of that 20 ethnic groups, 5 of them obtain part of that grant or whatever that is to celebrate their culture or their faith base, then there is another 15 that they feel left out. That by itself doesn't create some sort of the bias prejudice, and therefore could cause some sort of the radical action or reaction toward those communities.
Well, and I think that's a really important issue, actually, is to how do we find a voice? How do we build capacity in those communities that have been more silenced, whether it's because of their their own their own values or their own interests, or whether it's because they've been oppressed. But for me, that is a very important part of the game plan, right? Is to find a place at the table for all of those groups. And though if they aren't at the table because they feel like they've been silenced in the past, or because they feel like they don't have the community cohesion within that group to then come to the table, how can we deal with that? How can we build the capacity within the group?
And how do you what do you propose as an academic? What do you propose? Because if the government, let's say local government, you had recently had a by-election, I assume, for the member of the provincial parliament, and the people collectively, I mean, or majority at least, vote based.
Well, the majority that voted.
Majority, usually never majority of those who voted. I have numbers, a very disturbing number when it comes to the election, based on the actual number of eligible voters. But nevertheless, right now you have a member of the Conservative Party has been elected. And that right now, since liberals have the government, therefore they are in charge of the budget. But we had Mike Harris that they had charge of the budget. I'm just using that as an exhibit to follow the same example. Let's say if there is $2 million allocated to the multiculturalism in Oshawa for the year of the 2017 or 2016, and that to the person who decides how to allocate part or portion of that money has his own or her own party's agenda as a number of the factors to decide based on the number of the voters they get. So again, there is always a group is being disfranchised. That doesn't matter if it is liberal or conservative or NDP. So again, my point is not what they do. They do what they do. That is why I'm trying to have this awareness. But what I'm saying is the concept of the creating target for some groups being left out, and therefore, and we are humans. In every group, we can put in basket all sorts of different apples. You have always a couple rotten one there and a couple lunatic one as well. They go out and they smash the window of the mosque, or they put a swastika at the synagogue.
We saw it in the last
So the point is, if we want to stop, as you call it, some sort of the racism, shouldn't we have our government listen to people like academic people like yourself with a substantial solution in base solution, not necessarily party solution?
Yeah, empirically informed, or data informed decision making. Yeah, that's a really good question for my students. Actually, that's a good final exam question. I think for my students, I'll pose.
I will bill you.
No, absolutely. And the point, I guess the issue is what we tend to do, whether we're academics, whether we're in the public sphere, is it's sort of passive. Here's an open house, here's a town hall meeting, please come out. But I think that if we are, if you have a government entity, whether it's an individual ministry or an organization within a ministry, that outreach is more important than that passive approach. So that you know what the community, you need to know your community first of all, and you need to know what those silent parts of the community are, and then do very concentrated outreach to bring them all to the table. And you're right, there are going to be political biases in terms of who's identified, that sort of thing. But I think it comes to the more sort of the umbrella organizations, perhaps academics, but also organizations, entities that have a more inclusive vision of their community, not on the basis of identity, but their geographical or regional community, that they play a real important role at the grassroots to invite these diverse and silenced voices to the table. So it's about much more active outreach rather than passive. Announce something's happening and see who shows up.
The reason I brought that up, it's not by accident, because if you look at all of the policy, I mean most of the important policy, and I put it in the quotation because it's important for the party in the power. Important policies that comes to the effect in last few years has been climate change or climate control. They keep changing. First it was global warming, then climate something, and then now is climate change. Now, when you argue with them, because they are shoving more tax to the throat of all of the taxpayers and citizens, and under the name of the climate control, and their defense for doing that is we have to listen to scientists. How come when it comes to climate control and tax, they can listen to scientists, but if they want to spread their propaganda about the hate and hate-related crime or so-called prejudice and racism, why there is no mention of we discussed that with a few academic?
That's a really good question, and I gotta say that given the work that my colleague Ryan and I have done around right-wing extremism, that's a particularly important point in that context, because all the evidence to the contrary, there's been this denial of the role or the impact of white supremacist organizations, sort of right-wing hate groups, and the kinds of activities that they're involved in, so this is a question that we've been actually thinking about a lot in the last couple of years: is why is it that we deny the significance of othering in our context, and why don't we listen to scientists? And part of that is a historical legacy from the past 10 years or something of the Harper administration, which the social scientists were the first to go, and then it was the hard scientists, if you will. But in all of that time, I maintained connections with colleagues and friends in important portfolios. So in the Justice Department, for example, who were very interested in, what scholars had to say, what academics had to say. So the difficulty is not at the level of bureaucrats. They know the science, even the social science, and they value the social science. It's how it bubbles up to policymakers and administrators. When you had early years under Harper, a justice minister who said, we know what you're around harsher sentencing, for example, who said, we know what your data say, but that's irrelevant. That, we know what the right thing to do is.
well, again, right thing to do in the quotation, and
absolutely. How do you
because it's
that?
very subjective word, right thing to do. But what I do in right is right to me. It's not necessarily right to you, is it?
Right. Yeah. So there was a whole disavowal for like 10 years, disavowal of the value of science generally. And as I said, I think it was the social scientists who were particularly marginalized in that context, because of course, this is soft science. So there's a real tendency to disvalue the sort of work that we bring to the table.
Even just recently, I don't know how, if you are aware of, have you read it on the paper? I read it on the paper. I don't have any actual fact, but apparently they are creating a kind of the ministry or small ministry or mini ministry called under the racism by Kathleen Wynne government. In last,
I hadn't heard that. I hadn't heard any.
You haven't?
Every day, and I hadn't heard that.
Okay, they are creating, and they putting one of the minister of tourism and culture to be head of this so-called Ministry of Racism.
Interesting.
or Department of Races, I don't know the name, and it was on the paper again. I don't have any inside information, and by itself is like a, for me, at least from as I'm talking about myself, is like a spitting to my face and tell me there is a racism and we are not going to do anything about it, but we create another bureaucracy with the additional budget, with additional salary for a group of another bureaucrats to go around and tell you there is a racism and which racism is correct.
Yeah, rather than just saying, yeah, we acknowledge that there is a problem. I guess it depends on what the direction, what the mandate is of that.
Have you ever heard any mandate from our government that is not self-serving?
Of course not. Of course not. Yeah. But I mean, if they start at the, at the starting point where there's an acknowledgement, and I wonder to what extent that this comes out of the, recent conversations around, carding and all the problems with Toronto Police Services.
Yes.
And if that's a reaction to that. Also in the context of the federal initiative around Aboriginal issues. So
Bill C-51 is a good example of that.
There's a difference between whether this ministry is established with the mandate to establish that there is a problem, or mandate to say, yes, we know that there's a problem, and here are the programs that we want to to put in place. So yeah, I guess it depends on how that's structured. But I would be surprised if it came to life. Actually.
Oh, it was on first of all, just listen. I am handicapped in English language. It's so apparent in my conversation. Apparently, you find out. But even if you want to put a ministry to fight against racism, you don't call it racism. You call it anti-racism.
Yeah. No. A misnomer, right? Include, especially, it's 2016. We don't,
Yeah. Barb, you earlier mentioned about Islamophobia and the trends that become a fashion these days, so to speak, in this field. How do you define, first of all, Islamophobia, and what is its extent in Canada in general?
A really good question. So I guess in general terms, Islamophobia is sort of hostility and negative representations around Islam and around Muslims in particular. And I think in the Canadian context, that extends to just it's also around the ignorance of Islam in terms of what are the tenes.
Ignorance of knowing Islam, you mean, or ignorance?
Yeah, really.
Okay.
Really, sort of
just to clarify, it's not ignorance of the Muslim.
No, ignorance of what it is, right? What is Islam? What are the tenes and what are the the different, even we can call them sects within Islam, but also who are Muslims? Because in the North American context, and we certainly saw this after 9/11 immediately, who are Muslims? In the Canadian North American context, I would say maybe even the Western context, Muslims are brown people. And so we have, we don't do a very good job of distinguishing between Muslims and Sikhs and, Christians who come from Pakistan or India. So it's sort of, everyone from over there with that complexion are potentially Muslims. So there's, and that's not even vilification. That's just pure ignorance and inability to understand, sort of the ethnic and racial diversity within the Muslim community. So that's all, that I think informs also that hostility that I was talking about. So right now I'm working with a colleague in Australia on a book, for example, that is about Islamic vilification and violence, and how these negative images and these media images that we have of Islam also then render the community vulnerable to violence. And even in the Canadian context, this is, if you look at religiously motivated violence in Canada, that the vast majority of victims are still Jewish people within the Jewish community, but there is an uptick in Islamophobic violence as well. So that is troubling, and the violence tends to be more severe, and I think more geographically dispersed. I mean, there's a lot of anti-Semitism focused in Montreal, in Toronto. Islamophobia is sort of across the board, if you will. I've done a lot of work directly with the Muslim communities in this area, a lot of interviews, focus groups, working with people on the street as well as community leaders. And it is the fear within that community, the paranoia, if you will, about the potential for violence is really quite dramatic. It's also the area in which I've seen the most commentary around the role of the media in vilifying the community and thereby rendering them vulnerable to the violence. Again, I've worked with many communities, but this is where I've seen it most dramatically in terms of recognizing the role of media, but also the filtering through the media of political rhetoric that demonizes Muslim communities.
A couple things. When you, I agree with you that there is a level of the ignorance in not only here, in every culture. When you are facing different culture, different type of the people. A couple of things you mentioned about you said in Montreal and Toronto mostly is based on your study, the violence is against of the Jews in general, than the rest of the country that is more toward Islam, like Western and so on, Western Canada. Again, I make two comments and then I want to just shed some light on both. The first point is when you talk about the Jewish people or Jewish culture and Jewish people, again, the elements, the political elements of the government plays factor. For instance, you just earlier said in the last 10 years when we had the conservative government at the federal level, that they started to eliminate science and scientists, social scientists, and then other scientists. At the same token, they elevated the level of the support from the government of the Israel, which and allocating certain amount of the taxpayers' money to help that country, that could again instigate the resentment of certain faction of the society to resent what is happening, and therefore a couple of the lunatic go and do that on their own, or being controlled by a small faction. I don't know that. That is one thing. And second thing about the Muslim that you said, if someone comes from, let's say, Pakistan, who is Muslim or Christian, and it's very difficult, or if he's Sikh or Muslim, for a Canadian board to recognize, you must, although I am agnostic by choice, but I was born in a country that was predominantly Muslim. And the Muslim in my country is not my country, the country that I was born. My country is Canada now. But the Muslims who were born in Iran are different than Muslims who were born in Afghanistan, or Muslims who are in the Saudi, or Muslims who are in Malaysia. So painting everybody with the same brush would be not only unfair, but also is very dangerous. They're extremely dangerous to the point that could cause even global conflict. Don't you agree?
Easy questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
My questions are easy for someone like you.
Yeah, one thinks. With respect to the question of anti-Semitism, there's absolutely no doubt that, and I think with Islamophobia as well, there's absolutely no doubt that international affairs, relations, politics play into the domestic reactions to particular communities as well. And we certainly see that. There's again an extensive literature around anti-Semitism being a reaction to Zionist governments and their sort of uber support, if you will, of the Israeli state. So yeah, absolutely, and that being then support of the international Jewish conspiracy, of which right-wing supremacist organizations are so fond of describing. So yeah, absolutely no question that that almost intransigent stance will have an impact on those sectors of society who are already anti-Semitic, and seeing this as, just one more indication of the particular advantages of Jewish communities, if you will. So yeah, I have no question there. In terms of, I think you're also right about, our inability to, and I won't say necessarily unwillingness, I will say just inability to.
Yes, it's inability. It's very difficult.
Yeah, to recognize the differences between Muslim communities. Because to the extent, again, that feeds into the vilification and the violence that I referred to earlier, that is gonna embitter also. It has a cyclical impact, right? It also angers and embitters particular parts of the Muslim community, not necessarily domestically, but internationally. To the extent that we homogenize a whole community and hold them responsible for the actions of a few, there is going to be backlash, against that sort of homogenizing that hegemonic view of Islam.
The reason I brought those issues because I wanted to get your verification, because it's tied to goes back to the hate crime or hate-related crime. Because if you look at any community, let's say if we assume we have a pure Canada, I'm talking about pure, it's not pure Canada, indigenous people were the pure Canada, but what I'm saying, even if we assume, just for sake of discussion, we have a very Irish, Caucasian kind of the English Canada kind of the thing. If we have that, still different tribes, they have their own differences. It is general among every country in the world, and that is why we see all of this conflict. The reason I said that about the ignorance about or unfairness about painting every Muslim with the same brush is, if someone is from, let's say, Pakistan and is a Muslim and goes and beats someone from Malaysia who is another Muslim, or if someone is Shia, go and beat someone who is Sunni. Again, how not necessarily socially, how can you segregate the issue of the cultural ethnicity religion to and separate them and put it in the box of the hate crime? Because the person could beat him because he's Pakistani, or beat him because he was Muslim in Pakistan, or because he was culturally religiously Sunni and it was not Shia. Yeah. Or multiple combination of all. It's very, very strange kind of the mixture.
Yeah. Well, from a legal perspective, given the limitations of our data capacities and how we check off the boxes, that sort of thing, I mean, there would be no question that if it is motivated by their identity, by, their particular practice within Islam or whatever the case may be, or that they're Pakistani, there would be no doubt that, from a sociological perspective, we would identify that as hate crime. In terms of what box we tick from a legal perspective, that's when the difficulty arises. We don't have that capacity. I think there's an option to say multiple motivations, but that doesn't give you very much information, right? It doesn't unpack then, unless you look at the particular record, what the dynamics were there. So this is where, again, you mentioned earlier the role of academics, and I think this is where the the scholarship comes into play, because we can have those deeper conversations, not just looking at the numbers, but what underlies those numbers. So we can have, as I have had, conversations with Muslim communities and say, were you victimized? Do you think you were victimized because you're perceived to be Muslim, or because you're perceived to be an immigrant, or because you're perceived to be Pakistani, or all of those? Because it's not necessarily one or the other. It may in fact be that very intersectionality, because they represent three threats in that respect.
Not to mention proving each one of those checked boxes would be another challenge.
Yeah. And in the context of most criminal incidents, you won't have all of the information you need to be able to unpack that, especially because you don't often then catch the perpetrator, right? Because it's on the street, somebody walks by, they shout something, and they hit you, and then they run off. You're not gonna be able to necessarily track them down. So how do you know what their motivation was? It's left to the victim to guess at that. So yeah.
Bar, we are getting close to the end of the program. We have 2-3 minutes left. And my last question, probably that is not rather I take your opinion about that, is where you stand about free speech and how you include that in the issue of the hate crime, and the contrast between someone who says something and doing something.
Yeah, it really is an important distinction. And I'll say at the outset, I mean, I worked for 12 years in the U.S. and when I started working in this area of hate crime, it actually was in the U.S. So I'm very much biased by my experiences there and my dissatisfaction actually with the conversations around freedom of speech, because I think that there's such an extreme reaction there to any challenges to issues around freedom of speech. And I think that we have some balance here in terms of acknowledging the hurt and the impact associated with offensive speech. So we do have the propaganda legislation, which I think is very important to protecting targeted communities, especially from the escalation, because our propaganda legislation is around incitement to hatred, incitement to violence, incitement to genocide, those sorts of things. And I think that's so important to challenge language that will encourage others to escalate their level of not just rhetoric but action as well. But for me, my work is the act. It is the hate crime. It is the violence that's perpetrated against communities. But you do see often, an escalation from the speech to the violence. So it's important to acknowledge and be aware of the language that's led up to that. But I'm also pretty ambivalent about the legislation. It's been described as a blunt instrument. And not many people are aware of hate crime legislation, so it's not a deterrent. But it has its value as symbolic to the extent that we do talk about it as a moral wrong, as a legal wrong. But we don't enforce it. So, what teeth does it have? I think that, social policy reactions and interventions and educational interventions are much more impactful in terms of turning back the tide, in terms of challenging hate crime, as well as hate speech. And to call people out, as I say, at the individual level, calling people out on their racist comments and their homophobic jokes and those sorts of things.
Well, we back. I guess I'll be back to the square one, so to speak. Because again, because I am for one, I believe a world without complete free speech is a world that we cannot understand. Because we cannot read people's mind, but we can only interpret their behaviors to some extent. And not having free speech, we are trying to stifle not only creativity but also the danger that may exist. And for that reason, I am for full free speech personally, and incorporation of any just hurting other people's feeling into the law for me is absurd.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it is the incitement piece, right?
Yeah.
Is what is the impact?
I mean, if you just call people to rise up and do something against a particular group of people, to the extent first of all, you have to have that influence first. Second, I mean, even if you can be a loony and you go on the corner of the street and say, kill those Jews or kill those Muslims or kill, and nobody listens to you. I don't think that person should be prosecuted. First of all, you have to have a base, and second, you have to have evidence that such an incitement took place to some extent. My producer tells me that we are end of the program. First of all, I'm here. Thank you for joining with with us in this program. This program will be edited, not edited. We don't edit. Everything is uncensored. We don't by editing, I mean adding the names at the end of the. Do you want your emails to be added to the end of the program?
Sure, yeah, that would be fine.
So this will be available on YouTube for within next 3-4 days or so, or even earlier, depending how busy our producer is here. And then we don't have much of an audience, but it stays there on YouTube, and then it can be a precedent. And with your position, I am pretty sure your students enjoy watching this program.
I'll be using it for a lecture. It saves me an hour lecture.
Right. Thank you very much.
It was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much, and you have a nice evening.
You as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I have to and ladies and gentlemen, that was our program for this Tuesday, 23rd of the February 2016. Please remember, take part in your electoral process. Become volunteer, help your candidates write and discuss and communicate with your elected representatives in all levels of the government. And more importantly, the next time election comes around, roll up your sleeve and become a candidate yourselves. Good night.
Cast your ballot, hope for the best. This is where your votes rest. Oh, what we gonna do? Democracy, is it just a joke? Oscar Wilde said it best when he wrote simply, bludgeon of the people, by the people, for the people. And divide and conquer, well, that sometimes works. You can always find some sad soul who's been hurt to turn into a radical in the name of the Lord. So let the voters echo, let their voices be heard. Let us join together for a peaceful and better world, a place for everyone to have their say. Let the voters echo out today. Let the voters echo loud and free. So let the voters echo, let their voices be heard. Let us join together for a peaceful and better world, a place for everyone to have their say. Let the voters echo out today. Let the voters echo loud and free. Yeah, let the voters